to the Maryland Conservation Planting Guide. I'm here to provide you with a brief overview of what's in the guide and how to use this document. Okay, first off, where to find it. It's in the FOTG Section 2F, Plants and Planting Guidance. We recently reissued it in January of 2022. So if you haven't downloaded the latest version, please do so. We did make a few changes along the line. Okay, the purpose of the planting guide is to support our conservation practice standards. If you recall, if you heard my presentation on practice standards, we have a lot of documents and technical information that support our standards. This is one of those. This document provides plant species, mixes, and specifications for permanent cover ecological sciences practices. For example, conservation cover, tree shrub establishment, and also provides specs for the vegetative components of engineering practices, in particular critical area planting, which is often used to stabilize a structure. So if you're a technician, listen up. Okay, it does not include annual agronomic plantings such as conservation crop rotation, cover crop, that sort of thing. That information would be found in the conservation practice standard or in a separate set of specifications that go along with the standard and would be filed in that folder. The information in the planting guide was developed by NRCS technical specialists located here in Maryland and also in the Mid-Atlantic region. It's based on peer-reviewed research and publications from our plant material centers, universities, other public and private entities, and the content has been field tested over the years by NRCS and our partners. So I guess my takeaway for you here is it's science-based. It's not just one person's opinion. And it's based on the best available research and local experience. So, it's a pretty solid document, I think. Okay, what's in the planting guide? Well, there are 7 sections. And the first one is just general specifications and reference tables that will apply to everything else in the book. Then we get into plantings for a variety of purposes and uses, sections 2, 3, and 4. And we have more specialized plantings in sections 5, 6, and 7. And I'll get into all this in a little bit. Okay, section 1 provides general specs and reference tables, and we have basic written specifications for species selection, time of planting, and establishment methods. This is a couple of pages of that. Well, this is a little piece of that. And we have a table here to start with, so you can find the section in the planting guide, which section you use for a particular practice. And if you notice here, most practices have an option for more than one planting type, depending on the site conditions or how the planting will be used. So, you can kind of see here, where can you go depending on what you want to do. Next up, we have a plant hardiness zone map. You need to use this in order to determine what plant hardiness zone you're in, where the planting will be established. And you're thinking, why would I need to know that? Well, you need to know that because for the next table, when we're looking at planting dates for permanent cover, based on the type of plant material, you'll, for example, seeds, seedlings, container plants, and so on, and the location within the plant hardiness zone category, then this is going to tell you what your recommended planting dates are for permanent cover. For temporary cover, we have planting dates that are included in a table in section 3, and I'll show you that in a little bit. Okay, section 2 are upland herbaceous conservation plantings. These are seed mixes that are primarily for wildlife habitat enhancement and water quality improvement. These are sort of low to medium density. They're not real tough. They can provide erosion protection to some extent when site conditions are not severe. Some mixes are suitable for areas that receive light to moderate human use, such as for paths, walkways, travel lanes, that sort of thing. These plantings are generally not harvested, hayed, or grazed. They're mainly to provide cover. They're not used as an agricultural product per se. Some of the practices that use this section are, again, some of your wildlife practices, some of the water quality practices. You can see them here, and some of the buffer practices in particular. So these are just examples. There's a lot more. So, when you look at that table that starts out the whole story, you can see where all this falls. This table is what I would consider sort of a selection table. This will provide you, recommendations for the appropriate seed mix based on the purpose or the primary use of the planting. If you want to improve water quality and enhance wildlife habitat, you'll see check marks when a mix is recommended. And where it's maybe a possibility, you'll see a diamond. And where you don't see anything, it's generally not recommended at all. The next table provides our mixes based on plant hardiness zone, soil drainage class, plant height, native species status, type of grass in the mix. You can kind of see how this thing breaks out. The mixes are numbered, and sometimes people, once you get used to this thing, you start referring to things that you use often by the number, mix number 1. Okay. I do want to point out that most mixes in this table have options for species selection, so it's not just one size fits all. You'll need to choose the appropriate species based on the site conditions as well as on the client's preferences. And you're thinking, oh my gosh, how am I going to do that? Well, we provide you some recommendations over here in the remarks table that'll tell you a little bit about plant characteristics and maybe suitability for specific conditions. This is something as a planner or a technician you need to kind of take a look at and go, what's going to fit for what I want to do and the site I got to work with. And these are some of the things you might want to discuss with a landowner too, because he or she may have an opinion as to what they want, something tall, something short, whatever. So this is where some of your additional information is. In section 2, we have a couple more tables with more in-depth information on native grasses and grass-like plants and native wildflowers and legumes. And these are tables that you can use to look up individual species to see more about their characteristics. Maybe you need to do a substitution because something's not available, so it kind of lets you see what's similar to something that you need to replace. Moving on to section 3, this is rather similar to section 2, except these are high density plantings. They're upland plantings again, but we usually refer to them as critical area plantings. They're used to provide either temporary or permanent cover with high plant density, that plants will establish themselves relatively quickly. The permanent cover plantings are very durable, and they're typically used on highly erodible sites and on other sites where plantings are either difficult to establish, for example, on construction sites, or where they're difficult to maintain, for example, on a heavily used area. And again, these plantings are generally not harvested, hayed, or grazed. Might be mowed, of course, but they're not used for agricultural production per se. Here are some examples of practices that use this section, in particular, critical area planting, either as a standalone practice on highly erodible land, or it's often incorporated by reference into many engineering practice standards. So this is kind of the key standard that you're going to see using this. It's also used for field border, filter strip, forest trails and landings, for the berms of shallow water development and wetland restoration practices, and many others, but these are just some examples. We have the contents of this. We have specifications for selecting mixes and establishing plantings, and we have some tables. And by the way, if I didn't mention it already, and I don't think I did, this document has lots of tables. And if you don't like tables, well, this is not your document, but it's got a lot of tables. We shall see. As far as the specifications go, these are really detailed in this particular section, especially for engineering practices. And so a lot of this information, I believe, has now been incorporated into the engineering design templates for critical area planting or for the seeding mixes. So you're going to see a lot of this information in those design templates that if you're a technician or an engineer, that you can adapt for your particular site. But that's where it's coming from. It's coming from this section. So we have a table of temporary seeding, and reason you might use temporary seeding is if the time of year is just not right to put in a permanent planting. For example, if you want to plant typically a cool season grass and it's the middle of summer, well, that's not a good time to do that. So you want to get some erosion control, at least temporarily. Here's a table you can go to get recommendations for that. We have additional tables, of course. Again, we have a selection table for selecting a mix. We have a table of recommended mixes. And again, these mixes have options in them, so you need to read the remarks and figure out, what exactly are you going to use and why. And there's a table of seed quality, and this is typically used for seed purity and germination rates, and that's something you're going to see on a seed tag. So if you kind of wonder if what you're seeing on the seed tag is meeting the requirements, well, this is where you're going to find that information. Okay, trees and shrubs and woody vines. These are found in section 4, and typically used to provide native cover, especially for wildlife habitat. They're used for hedgerows, windbreak shelter belts, also for forest production and wetland restoration and other purposes. So, you know, it's the tree, shrub, woody, vine collection here. Some of the practices that use this section, again, sort of the wildlife type practices, the shrub components of these, hedgerows, windbreaks, wetland restoration, forest buffers, and so on. The section starts out with specifications for selecting species and establishing plantings, and then we go into some tables for deciduous trees, evergreen trees, shrubs, and woody vines. I'll show you a couple examples of those. This is the deciduous trees section. We have a table that is just generally provides, the first table provides a summary of various uses and characteristics of each species, and that's followed then in the next table by a table with a lot more in-depth information as far as, say, how tall it will get at 20 years, its growth rate, density in summer and winter, wildlife food value, that sort of thing. So you can get additional information from the second round, but the first table is kind of an overview summary kind of thing. There are also additional tables for specific topics, such as planting rates for wildlife habitat and water quality. We have a row spacing table for hedgerows. We have 2 tables for windbreaks, one for row spacing and the other for purpose and density requirements. That takes the information that's in the practice standard and kind of makes it into a table format that you can make a little more head or tail out of. At least I can. Section 5 is woody and herbaceous plantings for stream banks and shorelines. We only have one practice that really uses this section. It's very specific, Stream Bank and Shoreline Protection Code 580. And we have 3 tables in it, which I will show you. We have the first table is woody plants for stream banks and shorelines. The second one being companion grasses for, again, stream banks and shorelines. And the third table is herbaceous tidal shoreline plantings. So you're looking at tidal marsh plantings as well as dune plantings in that table. Very specific, and again, just pretty much applicable to the 580 standard. Section 6 is wetland herbaceous plantings. These are the practices that use this section are very specific again, the constructed wetland and the other wetland components, as well as shallow water development and management. So again, this is a very narrow group of practices that typically use these plantings. We have tables of seed mixes for temporary and permanent cover. We also have more detailed information in another table for native herbaceous wetland plants. And if you need trees and shrubs for wetlands, please refer back to section 4 because that's got tree and shrub stuff. Here's an example of table 6.1, herbaceous mixes. Again, set up in a very similar format to our mixed tables. And we have a second table, which is detailed species information on individual plants. The reason you might want this is if you're designing a wetland and you want to know what's going to grow in what depth of water. This is organized based on water regime and water depth. So this is kind of helpful to know, what grows where if you're not real familiar with it. Finally, on section 7, we have forage and biomass plantings. As you might expect, these are used for pasture, hay, or biomass production. This is the section actually that is used for production ag, pasture and hay planting, riparian herbaceous cover under very limited circumstances. If the site, for example, will be periodically harvested for forage or biomass. Usually it's not, but there is a possibility depending on the purpose and use and all that. And for the forage component of silvopasture. And we have tables. Boy, we have tables. We have a table of annual plantings. We have perennial cool season mixes. And we have some reference tables for cool season plantings and warm season plantings. So let me show you just real briefly some of that. The annual planting table is typically for extending the grazing season or providing emergency forage production. The perennial mixes are just that. They're for perennial pastures, basically, or hay. We have tables of cool season grasses with a lot of detailed information. There's 3 sets of those. And if you're looking to get more information on, say, recommended cultivars, or say you want to do a custom mix or something like that, then this provides you with seeding rates and a lot of other information that might be useful to you, or it might be useful to the producer if they want to get more information on a particular plant. And the same thing for warm season grasses. So same general references for that. I do have a few helpful hints to wrap this up. In the PDF document, I want to point out that you can really navigate around quickly if you hover over the table of contents or the list of tables. These are hot linked to the appropriate section of the document. You won't see them as links, but if you hover over them, you get the little hand, and then you can press on that, and off you go. So just keep that in mind if you're using the PDF. And also, if you're using the PDF, if you open the bookmarks sidebar, then you can use that to jump around too. And I find it useful to be able to jump back and forth to the table of contents and go jump to another section pretty quickly. So just a hint for you if you like to navigate around in the PDF. Another thing to point out is most of the tables have notes associated with them at the end. And these are really important. They provide definitions of some of the header information. They provide a lot more detail on seeding information, site prep, that kind of stuff. So it is really important that you do take a look at that, because we couldn't put everything in the tables. We have a lot of stuff in those tables, but this is where the rest of the information goes. And just a reminder, this is again in section 2F of the Field Office Technical Guide. It's the first thing in the list, so you can't miss it. And I really would recommend, I know we're all kind of working virtually these days, or pretty much, and probably mostly working online with the PDF version, but I really encourage you to download this, print it out, and carry it around with you in the truck or wherever, and flip through it and kind of get a sense of what's in here, because part of the trick in this business is just knowing where things are. And I think it's a lot easier, at least for me, to flip through a paper document as to kind of try to flip through a PDF. So just a hint, certainly your option as to how you want to use it. I use both, so I still need to get into the office and print out the latest version, but that's just a recommendation anyway. So I think that's all I got. And I will exit out of this.